In the autumn of 1988, the richest young woman in the world was found alone in a bathtub in a mansion outside Buenos Aires. She was not robbed. She was not murdered. There was no scandal, no dramatic final act, no villain standing over her with something to answer for. There was only a 37-year-old woman who had inherited $500 million, run one of the most powerful shipping empires in the history of global commerce, survived 4 marriages, outlived her entire immediate family by the age of 24, and arrived at the end of her life in a borrowed mansion in Argentina, in the company of people whose names the newspapers would struggle to identify by morning. The world had been watching Christina Onassis since she was old enough to appear in a photograph beside her father. It had watched her through the marriages and the divorces and the tabloid headlines and the business triumphs that the tabloids, preferring the other stories, mostly ignored. It had watched her gain weight and lose it and gain it again. It had watched her fall in love with the wrong people and be let down by them, repeatedly, with a consistency that suggested something more than bad luck. What the world had never done, not once, in 37 years of watching was see her. Not really. Not past the name. Not past the father. Not past the shadow of Aristotle Onassis, which was so enormous, so completely consuming, that it followed his daughter across every ocean his ships had ever sailed, and never once let her stand in her own light. This is the story of Christina Onassis. To understand Christina Onassis, you must first understand what it meant to be the child of Aristotle Onassis, not the business, not the ships, not the island or the yacht or the art collection or the political connections that stretched from Athens to Washington to the Vatican. Those things are well documented. What is less documented, what requires a different kind of attention, is what it felt like to grow up in the gravitational field of a man like that. A man for whom the world existed primarily as a stage, and who expected the people around him, including his children, to understand their roles in the production. Aristotle's Socrates Onassis had built himself from nothing with a ferocity that left very little room for softness. Born in Smyrna in 1906, he had survived the burning of that city by Turkish forces in 1922, had arrived in Argentina as a teenage refugee, and had constructed, through a combination of intelligence and ruthlessness and an almost supernatural ability to read the direction of the world's appetite, one of the great private fortunes of the 20th century. His shipping empire moved oil and cargo across every major ocean. His name appeared regularly alongside those of presidents and kings. His photograph was on the front page of newspapers in languages he did not speak. He was also, by the accounts of those who knew him with any intimacy, a man of enormous personal magnetism. Funny, generous in the extravagant way of people who have never forgotten what it was to have nothing, and possessed of a quality that his daughter would spend her entire life trying and failing to replicate in the people she loved. The ability to make whoever was in the room feel, completely and convincingly, that they were the only person in the world. Tina Onassis, born Athena Mary Livanos, daughter of Stavros Livanos, founder of another great Greek shipping dynasty, was everything her husband wanted in a wife and considerably more than he deserved in a human being. She was 20 when she married Aristotle in 1946. She was beautiful and socially accomplished and had grown up in a world that understood exactly what the Onassis marriage represented: the consolidation of 2 great Greek maritime fortunes, a union of dynasties that the Greek shipping community regarded with the reverence that earlier centuries had reserved for royal alliances. She was also deeply unhappy in the marriage, though she was far too disciplined to say so publicly, and far too skilled at the performance of contentment to let it show in the photographs. Christina was born into this, into the glamour and the tension and the vast, humming machinery of her father's ambition. She and her brother Alexander were raised across 3 countries, France, Greece, England, in the manner of the very wealthy international class, which is to say they were raised in beautiful places by excellent staff, with parents who appeared and disappeared according to schedules that had nothing to do with school terms or childhood needs, and everything to do with the requirements of business and society. Alexander was the favorite. This is not a cruel thing to say, it is simply what the evidence shows. Aristotle Onassis wanted a son to inherit his empire, in the ancient and unchanging tradition of patriarchs who build things and need somewhere to direct them when they are gone. Alexander was handsome and daring and had inherited his father's dark intensity. Christina adored her brother with the wholehearted, uncomplicated love that younger siblings sometimes give to older ones, the love that does not ask anything back, that is grateful simply for the presence. Christina, by contrast, was not what her world had been expecting. She was not, as a child and young woman, the kind of beauty that the society pages celebrated. Not in the way that her mother was beautiful, or her cousin Eugenia, or the other daughters of the Greek shipping dynasties who populated the same international circuit. She was dark-haired, full-figured, with her father's intensity in her face and none of her mother's porcelain elegance. She was also, from a very young age, acutely aware of this, aware in the way that girls who grow up in worlds that value beauty above almost everything else always become aware, with a precision that is indistinguishable from cruelty, directed entirely at themselves. She attended the Headington School in Oxford, one of England's finest girls' schools, the kind of institution that produced well-spoken, well-read, well-connected women of the international class. She subsequently attended Queen's College London. She was, by the accounts of people who knew her then, genuinely intelligent, quick, perceptive, with a gift for languages, and a talent for business that would only fully reveal itself later, under the worst possible circumstances. What she did not have, in those school years, was any very clear sense of who she was outside the context of her father's name. At Headington and Queen's College, Christina Onassis was not a girl trying to find herself. She was the daughter of Aristotle Onassis trying to find a self that wasn't defined by him, which is a considerably more difficult project, and one that, as it turned out, she would never quite complete. In 1960, when Christina was 9 years old, her parents divorced. The proximate cause was Aristotle's affair with Maria Callas, the Greek soprano, the most celebrated operatic voice of the century, a woman whose intensity matched his own in a way that Tina's quiet, aristocratic composure never quite had. The affair had been an open secret in the circles they moved in for some time before the divorce made it official. Tina, who had absorbed the humiliation with the dignity her upbringing required, eventually reached the limit of what dignity could absorb and filed for divorce in New York. Christina was 9. She did not, by most accounts, understand what had happened with any precision. What she understood was what children always understand from divorce, that the world she had known had been replaced by a different world, and that the replacement had not been her decision. The divorce was the first of several seismic events that would reshape Christina's world without her consent. But it was not, in the end, the most devastating. That was still coming. What came first in 1968 was something that felt at the time like a different order of loss entirely. Something that was not death but that carried, for Christina and her brother Alexander, something of death's permanence. Their father married Jacqueline Kennedy. Jackie Kennedy was, in October of 1968, the most famous widow in the world. 5 years after Dallas, 5 years after the image of her in the pink Chanel suit had been burned into the collective memory of a civilization, she had decided, quietly, privately, with the self-possession that had always been her most defining quality, that she was going to stop being a symbol and start being a person. Aristotle Onassis, with his island and his yacht, and his absolute indifference to the opinion of anyone whose opinion he had not specifically solicited, seemed to offer the one thing that America could not: invisibility, privacy, a world insulated from the demands of public grief. The marriage took place on October 20th, 1968, on Scorpios. Christina and Alexander did not attend willingly. By most accounts, Christina and Alexander never accepted their stepmother. The word distrusted appears in almost every account: distrusted Jackie, resented Jackie, regarded her as an interloper in the dynasty their father had built, and which they had understood, on some unspoken level, to be theirs. There were specific grievances. Financial ones. Questions about what Jackie's presence would mean for the inheritance. The rational complaints of children who had grown up in a world where money and love were so thoroughly intertwined that it was impossible to entirely separate them. But underneath the rational complaints was something simpler and less rational. Christina had spent her entire childhood trying to earn the full attention of a father who was always looking elsewhere. And now he had found someone else to look at. Someone the entire world was already looking at, And the competition was one that Christina Onassis, with all her intelligence and all her father's money, was not equipped to win. She was 17 years old. She had a father who had replaced her mother with the most famous woman in the world. She had a brother she loved entirely. She had a mother who would, in the years that followed, make her own catastrophic choice, marrying Stavros Niarchos, the widower of her own sister Eugenia, a marriage that sent a particular kind of shockwave through the Greek shipping world that understood exactly what it signified. And she had, somewhere underneath all of it, a self that was trying very hard to exist. What happened next would test that self in ways that no 17-year-old should ever have to face, because the losses, the real losses, the irreversible ones, had not yet begun. Christina Onassis entered adulthood in the way that children of very powerful men often do, not gradually, not on her own terms, but in response to circumstances that gave her no choice about the timing. She was 20 years old in 1971. She had completed her education in Oxford and London. She had grown up across 3 countries, in the company of household staff and tutors and the children of other dynasties, and she had emerged from this upbringing with something that her world had not necessarily expected to find in her: genuine capability. A mind that understood money and movement and the logic of global commerce in a way that was not inherited but learned, absorbed, during all those years of watching her father work, with more attention than anyone had noticed her paying. But before the business, before the empire and the inheritance and the extraordinary story of what she did with both, there was a marriage. The first one. Joseph Balker was 50 years old when Christina Onassis married him in July of 1971. He was a Los Angeles real estate developer. American, divorced, the father of 4 daughters, entirely outside the world of Greek shipping dynasties and European social circuits that Christina had been raised in. He was, by every measure that Aristotle Onassis applied to the men in his daughter's life, wrong. Wrong in age, 27 years her senior. Wrong in background, wrong in nationality. Wrong in the fundamental sense that he had not been selected, approved, or in any way sanctioned by the man who regarded his daughter's life as an extension of his own strategic planning. Christina married him anyway. It is not difficult to understand why, if you have been paying attention to what her life had looked like up to that point. Balker was warm. He was steady. He was a man who had built his own life, who did not need her money or her name, who seemed to want her, simply, straightforwardly, without the calculations that surrounded every other relationship in her world. He was, in other words, the opposite of everything she had grown up watching. Aristotle Onassis was reportedly furious. The fury was not subtle. He made his displeasure known through the channels available to a man of his means and temperament, pressure, financial and personal, applied with the precision of someone who had spent decades understanding exactly which lever to pull in any given situation. He did not disown his daughter. He did something more effective. He made clear, in terms that left no ambiguity, that the marriage was unacceptable and that its continuation would have consequences. The marriage lasted 9 months. On January 23, 1973, Alexander Onassis was piloting an amphibious plane near Athens when it crashed on takeoff from the sea. He was 24 years old. The injuries were catastrophic. He was airlifted to hospital. The world's finest neurological specialists were flown in, his father, who had built an empire on the premise that money could solve any problem, threw every resource available to him at the problem of keeping his son alive. Alexander Onassis died on January 23, 1973, 36 hours after the crash. Some sources give the date of his death as the following day. Christina was 22 years old. She had lost her brother, the person she had loved most completely, most simply, most without condition in her entire life. The one relationship in her world that had not been complicated by money or dynasty or the performance of belonging, the one person who had known her before she became a symbol of anything. He was gone. Aristotle Onassis never recovered from Alexander's death. This is not a figure of speech. The clinical reality is that he began, in the months following January 1973, a physical decline that his doctors attributed in part to myasthenia gravis, a neuromuscular condition that weakened him progressively, but that those who knew him described in simpler terms. He had lost the thing he had been building toward, the son who was supposed to carry the name forward, the continuation of everything. He turned, in the aftermath, to his daughter. And here is where the story of Christina Onassis takes the turn that defines everything that follows. Because Aristotle, faced with the reality that Christina was now his only heir, did something that was simultaneously the most important thing he ever gave her and the most complicated. He began to treat her as his successor. She was sent to New York to work in the Onassis offices on Fifth Avenue. She was given access to the operations of the business, the shipping routes, the negotiations, the commercial relationships that constituted one of the most complex private enterprises in the world. She worked. She listened. She learned, with the focused attention of someone who understands that what is being offered is not a gift but a preparation. She was 22 years old, and she was being trained to run a $500 million empire by a father who was dying and who needed her to be ready before he was gone. In 1974, Tina Onassis, Christina's mother, the woman who had maintained her composure through the divorce and the Jackie Kennedy marriage and the specific humiliation of watching her ex-husband become the most talked-about man in the world, died. She was 45 years old. The cause was recorded as a suspected drug overdose, though the full circumstances were never entirely resolved. She left Christina her estate, valued at $77 million. Christina had now lost her brother and her mother within 13 months. She was 23 years old. Aristotle Onassis died in March of 1975 at the American Hospital of Paris, the institution that his daughter would later endow, in a gesture of grief and gratitude and the complicated love of a child for a parent who had never quite managed to be present in the way she needed. He left Christina 55% of his fortune, then estimated at $500 million. The remaining 45% went to the Alexander S. Onassis Foundation, established in her brother's memory. After a legal settlement, Jacqueline Onassis received $26 million from the estate. In 29 months, Christina Onassis had lost her brother, her mother, and her father. She was 24 years old. She was now the sole heir to one of the great private fortunes in the world, the controlling shareholder of a shipping empire that operated across every major ocean, and the last Onassis. She did something then that surprised the business world, and that should not have surprised anyone who had been paying attention. She ran it, not symbolically, not as a figurehead while professional managers made the actual decisions. Christina Onassis took control of Olympic Maritime and ran it, negotiating with the same oil companies and port authorities and shipping consortiums that her father had built relationships with over decades, making decisions that affected the movement of cargo across the world's oceans, demonstrating a commercial intelligence that the industry, which had not expected it, was forced to acknowledge. She also renounced her American citizenship, as her father had done before her, and donated the American portion of her holdings to the American Hospital of Paris. She held dual citizenship in Greece and Argentina throughout her life. A woman of 3 countries and no single home, carrying a name that belonged to the sea and had never quite belonged to anywhere on land. The business community learned to take her seriously. It did not always want to. The tabloids had established a version of Christina Onassis that was about marriages and weight and the particular spectacle of an heiress who seemed to keep making the same mistakes. But the shipping industry is not interested in tabloids. It is interested in whether the ships arrive and whether the contracts are honored, and whether the person across the negotiating table knows what they are doing. Christina Onassis knew what she was doing. She knew what she was doing in boardrooms and in shipping negotiations, and in the management of a complex, multinational business empire that her father had left her without a manual. What she did not know, what she had never been taught, what the world of Aristotle Onassis had not offered as part of the curriculum, was how to be alone. How to exist in the space between the work and the world without filling it with something. Someone, the loneliness that had followed her since childhood, since the divorce, since the Jackie Kennedy marriage, since the boarding schools and the beautiful empty houses and the brother who was gone and the mother who was gone and the father who was gone, had not been solved by the inheritance. If anything, it had intensified, the way that silence intensifies in a large house when there is no one else in it. She was 24 years old, and she was the last Onassis, and she had $500 million and a shipping empire and an island in the Ionian Sea. And she was profoundly, structurally, almost constitutionally alone. The marriages were coming, 3 more of them after Balker, each one carrying within it some version of the same hope. That this one, this person, this particular arrangement of love and contract and shared life, would finally fill what the money had not been able to fill, and the business had not been able to fill, and the island and the fame and the inheritance had not been able to fill. And one of the marriages, the last one, the one she believed in most completely, would prove to be the most devastating thing that had happened to her since the 29 months that had taken her entire family. But before that, there was Russia, and no one who knew Christina Onassis saw Russia coming. Onassis saw Russia coming. There is a particular kind of grief that does not arrive all at once. It comes in stages, first the loss itself, then the management of the loss, the legal and practical machinery that death sets in motion, and that keeps the bereaved occupied with logistics precisely when the alternative would be too much to bear. And then, when the lawyers have finished and the estate has been settled and the world has moved on to its next story, the grief arrives properly. Quietly. In the middle of an ordinary afternoon, in a room that used to contain someone who is no longer there. Christina Onassis, in the months following her father's death in March of 1975, was managing 3 simultaneous griefs: her brother, her mother, her father, while simultaneously managing a $500 million business empire, deflecting the legal claims of a stepmother, and trying to establish, for the first time in her life, who she actually was when there was no one left to define herself in relation to. It was, by any human measure, too much, and the ways in which it was too much began to show. Christina Onassis was diagnosed with clinical depression at the age of 30. But the depression, the clinical, documented reality of it, had its roots in a much earlier soil. The anxiety that had stalked her since childhood. The deep insecurity about her appearance that had been planted early and tended, inadvertently, by a world that valued a particular kind of beauty and made its preferences known. The grief that had arrived in 3 waves within 29 months and had never been properly processed because there had been an empire to run and a dynasty to maintain and a name to carry. She was prescribed barbiturates, amphetamines, sleeping pills, the pharmaceutical vocabulary of the 1970s for a woman who could not sleep and could not stay awake and could not find, in the architecture of her daily life, anything that felt like solid ground. She developed dependencies on these medications that would shadow her for the rest of her life. She was also, throughout these years, in a private war with her own body, a war that had begun during the Reventlow years in a different story, in a different heiress, but that in Christina's case had its own particular origins and its own particular cruelty. The world watched her wait with the merciless attention that it reserves for women whose bodies are considered public property. And the tabloids documented every fluctuation with a specificity that was dressed up as concern, and was actually something considerably less kind. What the tabloids did not document, what did not make good copy, was what the weight meant, what it was carrying, what it was a response to. The body, as it always does, was keeping its own account of what the mind was enduring. And the account, by the mid-1970s, was considerable. The second marriage, to Alexander Andrides, the Greek shipping and banking heir, came in 1975, within months of her father's death. Andrides was, on paper, everything that Aristotle Onassis would have approved. Greek, from a shipping family, the right background, the right connections, the right nationality. He was, in the language of the dynasty, an appropriate match. He was also, in the ways that actually mattered, wrong for her, though it would take 14 months for the marriage to make this official. The Andrides marriage has been described by those who observed it as a practical arrangement that both parties entered with more hope than foundation. Christina, newly bereaved and newly in command of an empire she had not expected to inherit so soon, was looking for stability, for someone to stand beside her in a world that had become, very suddenly, entirely her responsibility. Andrides, for his part, was entering a union with the most powerful woman in Greek shipping, and the complications that attended that fact were not simple. The divorce came in 1977, quietly by the standards of what would follow, and then came Sergei Kozov. Sergei Danilovich Kozov was a Soviet shipping agent. He was working, when he met Christina, in a capacity that gave him professional contact with the Onassis shipping interests. the Soviet state shipping organization had commercial relationships with various Western maritime companies, and these relationships required intermediaries who could navigate both worlds. Kozov was one of these intermediaries. He was also, reportedly, intelligent, quietly charming, and entirely unlike anyone Christina Onassis had previously encountered. Not Greek, not European in any of the ways she had grown up understanding European. Not wealthy, not titled, not operating according to any of the social codes that governed the world she had been born into. He was Soviet. He lived in Moscow. He was, by the standards of the Greek shipping dynasty, the most improbable husband imaginable. Christina married him in 1978. She moved to Moscow. This fact has never quite lost its capacity to astonish, and it should not. Christina Onassis, heiress to a Greek shipping fortune, controlling shareholder of one of the great private maritime empires. A woman whose financial interests extended across every major ocean, moved to Moscow at the height of the Cold War to live as the wife of a Soviet citizen in an apartment that was, by any comparison with what she had grown up in, almost aggressively ordinary. The Western press did not know what to do with this information. The story they had been telling about Christina Onassis, spoiled heiress, troubled romantic life, poor little rich girl in the Barbara Hutton tradition, did not accommodate a woman who voluntarily surrendered the infrastructure of extreme wealth to live in a Moscow apartment. It did not fit the narrative. What it fit, if you had been paying attention, was something simpler. Christina Onassis, in Moscow, in an ordinary apartment, with a man who had no particular interest in her money because he lived in a system where her money was largely irrelevant, was, by several accounts, calmer than she had been in years. Quieter, more herself. The marriage lasted 1 year. They divorced in 1979. The pattern that had established itself, the marriages entered with hope, the hope colliding with something structural that hope alone could not fix, the divorce, the return to the empire, and the loneliness and the medications, and the body that was keeping its own account. This pattern was not invisible to Christina herself. She was not without self-awareness. She knew, on the level at which intelligent people always know the things about themselves they most wish were not true, what she was doing. She knew that the marriages were attempts to solve a problem that marriage could not solve. She knew that the loneliness she was trying to outrun had its roots somewhere that a husband could not reach. She knew. And in 1984, at the age of 33, she married again. His name was Thierry Roussel. He was French. He was handsome in the particular way of certain European men of the 1980s, well-dressed, socially fluent, possessed of the easy confidence of someone who has grown up in comfort without ever having had to build anything. He came from a family with pharmaceutical money, not Onassis money, nothing close, but enough to give him the surface of independence. He also had, at the time he married Christina Onassis, a long-term mistress, a Swedish model named Marianne Landhage, known to her circle as Gaby. This was not unknown to people in their social world. Whether it was known to Christina at the time she married him has been a matter of some debate among those who have written about her life. What is not a matter of debate is what happened next. In 1985, Christina gave birth to a daughter. She named her Athena, after her own mother, the beautiful Tina who had married Aristotle Onassis and endured and eventually departed and died at 45 in circumstances that were never entirely clear. Athena, the name carried everything, the mother, the grief, the hope, the dynasty, the last Onassis giving her child the name of the woman who had started it all. Christina loved her daughter with the ferocity of someone who has lost everyone else. And Thierry Roussel, during the pregnancy and after it, continued his relationship with Marianne Landhage. He fathered a child with her. During the marriage. When Christina discovered this, and the accounts of exactly when and how she discovered it vary, but the discovery itself is not in question, something broke in her that had been, up to that point, still capable of being repaired. She had survived the loss of her brother. She had survived the loss of her mother and her father within 13 months of each other. She had survived 3 failed marriages and a pharmaceutical dependency, and the tabloid attention of 3 continents, and the weight of a name that was simultaneously her greatest inheritance and her greatest burden. She had survived all of it. But there is a specific quality to the betrayal of someone you chose to believe in, someone you chose, with full knowledge of your own history of disappointment, to trust anyway. someone you gave a child to, someone in whom you invested not just love, but the decision, conscious and costly, to try one more time. That specific quality is what Thierry Rousseau gave Christina Onassis, and it was, as it turned out, the crack that let everything else in. The fall that followed was not loud. It was not dramatic in the way the tabloids preferred their dramas. It was quiet, and it was physical, and it moved with the terrible patience of something that has been building for a very long time. Christina Onassis divorced Thierry Rousseau. She was given custody of Athena, and she began, in the years between the divorce and the autumn of 1988, a slow withdrawal from the world. Not into scandal, not into anything the newspapers could easily name, but into a private diminishment that the people closest to her watched with increasing alarm and decreasing ability to intervene. The last chapter of her life had begun, and it would end in a mansion outside Buenos Aires, in a bathtub, on a November morning, 37 years after she had arrived in a Manhattan hospital and been given the name that would define and confine and ultimately consume her. The divorce from Thierry Rousseau was finalized in 1987. Christina was given custody of Athena. The child was 2 years old, dark-haired, serious-eyed, already carrying in her small face the particular gravity of the Onassis line. Christina loved her daughter in the way she had loved very few things in her life. Completely, without strategy, without the careful emotional rationing that her experience of loss had taught her to apply to everything else. Athena was the one relationship in her world that was entirely, unambiguously hers. The one person who could not leave voluntarily. The one person whose presence was not contingent on anything Christina did or did not do. She was also, at 2 years old, a child who needed a mother who was well. And Christina Onassis, in the years following the Rousseau divorce, was not well. The pharmaceutical dependencies that had taken hold in her late 20s had deepened through the 1980s. The barbiturates, the sleeping pills, the medications prescribed across multiple countries by multiple doctors who did not always know what the others were prescribing. This was a common arrangement among the very wealthy of her generation, who moved between countries and physicians with the same ease with which they moved between hotels, and for whom the absence of a single coordinating doctor was not a gap in care, but simply the geography of their lives. She was also, through these years, engaged in the long and private war with her own health that had begun in her 20s. A war that manifested in the physical ways that the tabloids documented, and in the internal ways that they did not have access to and would not have known how to report if they had. She surrounded herself, in these years, with a particular kind of company. The company of people who wanted to be near her, who wanted to attend the dinners and the parties and the gatherings that her name and her money made possible, and who were, many of them, considerably less interested in her actual well-being than in the access she provided. The court of the very wealthy in decline is a particular social ecosystem, and Christina Onassis in the mid to late 1980s was at its center, still generous, still capable of extraordinary warmth, still the person who would press money into the hands of someone who seemed to need it and feel, in the giving, the brief approximation of connection, still looking, still hoping. She spent time on Scorpios in these years, as she always had, returning to the island the way that people return to the places where they were most themselves, even when those places are also the places where they were most hurt. The island held her father and her brother. It held the summers of her childhood, before the divorce and the Jackie Kennedy marriage, and the 29 months that took everyone. It held a version of herself that predated the inheritance and the empire and the tabloid coverage and the 4 marriages. She could walk on Scorpios and be, briefly, just Christina, not the last Onassis, not the poor little rich girl, a nickname that had followed her as it had followed Barbara Hutton before her, as if the world had only one vocabulary for women who had too much and suffered anyway. Just the girl who had grown up on this island, who had swum in this water, who had sat in this chapel, and listened to the liturgy of a church that connected her to something older and more permanent than the business empire or the social world or the marriages. In November of 1988, Christina Onassis traveled to Argentina. She had connections to Argentina that went back to her father. Aristotle Onassis had built his first fortune in Buenos Aires, had held Argentine citizenship, had regarded the country with the particular affection of a man who had been nobody there, and had become, through his own effort and intelligence, somebody. Christina held Argentine citizenship herself, one of the 3 nationalities of a woman who had never quite belonged anywhere. She was staying at a mansion in Tortuguitas, a small community outside Buenos Aires, the kind of place where wealthy Argentines kept country properties, away from the city. She was visiting friends. She was, by the accounts of those who saw her in the days before her death, in variable spirits, sometimes animated, sometimes withdrawn, the fluctuation that had characterized her for years. On the morning of November 19, 1988, Christina Onassis was found by her maid. She was in the bathtub. She was 37 years old. The autopsy found no evidence of suicide, no evidence of drug overdose, no foul play. Christina Onassis had died of a heart attack caused by acute pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs, a condition that can develop rapidly, and that, in a body that has been under the particular stresses that hers had been under for the better part of a decade, can be catastrophically sudden. She was 37 years old. Her daughter Athena was 3. The news moved across the world in the way that the deaths of the famous move, first the wire services, then the newspapers, then the radio bulletins, then the television programs interrupting themselves to announce that the last Onassis was gone. In shipping offices in Athens and London and New York, in the social circles of Paris and Monte Carlo and the Greek islands, in the tabloid newsrooms that had tracked her life for 2 decades. The same sentence, in multiple languages, simultaneously. Christina Onassis is dead. The funeral was held the following day, November 20th, at the chapel on Scorpios. It was private. Small. The people who attended were the people who had actually known her, not the social world, not the press, not the vast peripheral population that had orbited her wealth and her name without ever quite reaching her. The people who came to Scorpios on that November morning were the people who had, in their various ways, actually been present. She was buried in the Onassis family plot, beside her father and her brother. 3 graves now, where there had been 1. And here is what the obituaries, in their decent haste to summarize a life into column inches, mostly failed to say. Christina Onassis ran a $500 million empire for 13 years, between the ages of 24 and 37. She did it without a co-founder, without a board of directors she had inherited from her father, without the institutional support that most people in her position would have surrounded themselves with. She negotiated with oil companies and port authorities and shipping consortiums. She made decisions that affected the livelihoods of thousands of people in dozens of countries. She expanded the business in some areas, rationalized it in others, and delivered it, intact, solvent, still one of the significant private maritime operations in the world, to the foundation established in her brother's name. She did all of this while managing a pharmaceutical dependency, while fighting a public war with tabloids that documented her body and her marriages with an attention that would now be recognized as a form of harassment, while grieving, without adequate support or sufficient time, the loss of every member of her immediate family before she was 25 years old. She was not, as the tabloid shorthand insisted, simply the troubled heiress who married badly and spent freely and struggled publicly. She was all of those things, yes, but she was also a serious businesswoman who performed, under impossible circumstances, at a level that most of her critics could not have matched without the circumstances. She was a mother who loved her daughter with everything she had left after the empire, and the grief and the medications had taken their portions. She was a person who gave money away, to individuals, to institutions, to the American Hospital of Paris that had tried to save her father, with the same impracticality and the same genuine impulse that had characterized Barbara Hutton's giving in an earlier generation. She was, in other words, a complete human being, and the world had spent 37 years looking at her and seeing primarily a symbol. Athena Onassis would inherit $250 million, equivalent to approximately $680 million in today's money. She would receive half of it on her 18th birthday, the rest later. She would be raised in Switzerland, far from Scorpios, far from Greece, far from the shipping world and the social world and the particular atmosphere of the Onassis legacy. She would also, as she grew older, become the subject of tabloid attention in the way that the Onassis name guaranteed tabloid attention. She would marry, she would be photographed, she would be written about, she would be the last Onassis, just as her mother had been. The ships continued to sail. The foundation established in Alexander's name continued its work, funding cultural and educational initiatives that still operate today, that have funded scholarships and arts programs, and the kind of quiet, lasting institutional generosity that does not generate headlines. The island remained in the family, or what remained of the family, which was now a 3-year-old girl in Switzerland who had never swum in the water around Scorpios and who did not yet know what the island meant, or what the name meant, or what had been spent in every currency, not just the financial one, in the attempt to keep it alive. And in a bathtub in a mansion in Tortuguitas, outside Buenos Aires, on the morning of November 19, 1988, the story of the Onassis dynasty had reached its end. Not with a transaction, not with a negotiation, not with the kind of dramatic, documented moment that her father's life had specialized in producing. Quietly, privately, in a house that was not hers, in a country that was partly hers, in the company of people who found her and called for help that arrived too late. 37 years old, the last one, gone. The last one, gone. The world moved on from Christina Onassis with the speed it always applies to the deaths of the famous. A week of obituaries, a month of retrospectives, and then the next story, the next face, the next dynasty to watch. What did not move on were the consequences. They settled, slowly and permanently, into the lives of the people left behind. Athena Onassis was 3 years old when her mother died. She was placed, per the custody arrangements that had been established during the divorce, in the care of her father Thierry Roussel and his partner, soon to become his wife, Marion Landhage. The couple raised Athena in Switzerland, in a household that included the children Roussel had fathered with Marion during his marriage to Christina. Let that arrangement present itself fully. The child of Christina Onassis was raised, in the years following her mother's death, by the man whose infidelity had broken her mother, and by the woman he had been unfaithful with. This was not, in the legal sense, avoidable. Roussel was Athena's father. The custody arrangements were what they were. The law does not make allowances for the particular cruelty of the geometry, but it means that Athena Onassis grew up knowing her mother primarily through the accounts of people who had, in the most intimate possible way, wronged her. On her 18th birthday, in December 2003, Athena Onassis gained control of half her inheritance, approximately $125 million. The remainder followed later. She was, at 18, among the wealthiest young people in the world, inheriting a fortune built by a grandfather she had never met, passed through a mother she had lost at 3, administered by a father who had not earned it. She married, in 2005, the Brazilian show-jumping champion Álvaro de Miranda Neto, known as Doda. The tabloids covered the wedding with the attention they had always devoted to the Onassis name. The marriage ended in divorce in 2017. She was, in other words, navigating, as her mother had navigated, as her grandfather in his different way had navigated, the specific difficulty of being an Onassis, of carrying a name that the world had decided was interesting. And that came with a weight and a history, and a set of expectations that had consumed everyone who had carried it before her. Scorpios passed, after Christina's death, into a complicated arrangement of ownership and administration that eventually resulted, in 2013, in the island being sold. The buyer was Ekaterina Rybolovleva, the daughter of a Russian billionaire, for a reported price of approximately 150 million euros. The Onassis family plot remains on the island. The graves are still there. Aristotle, Alexander, Christina, in the earth of the island that was supposed to be the permanent heart of a dynasty that is no longer there to inhabit it. The Alexander S. Onassis Foundation has continued, in the decades since Christina's death, to operate as one of the significant cultural and educational philanthropies of the Greek world. It funds scholarships, the Onassis Scholarships, awarded to students from around the world for study in Greece and Greek studies abroad. It funds cultural programs, theatrical productions, arts initiatives. It has, in its quiet institutional way, done what dynasties are supposed to do when the people are gone: continued, contributed, made the name mean something beyond the gossip columns. It is, in many ways, the most lasting legacy of the Onassis story, more lasting than the ships, more lasting than the island, more lasting than the marriages and the divorces and the tabloid coverage and the nicknames. Scholarship, education, culture, built on the memory of a 24-year-old boy who died in a plane crash in Athens and whose father could not survive the loss of him. The Onassis shipping interests were gradually restructured and consolidated in the years following Christina's death. The empire that Aristotle had built from nothing and that Christina had maintained against considerable odds was absorbed, over time, into the larger architecture of the global shipping industry. Still operating, still significant, but no longer the personal expression of a single family's will and ambition that it had been during the decades of Aristotle's dominance. Thierry Rousseau, the fourth husband, the man whose infidelity had been the final wound, married Marion Landhage, and continued his life in the way that men who have benefited from proximity to great fortunes sometimes continue their lives, comfortably, quietly, outside the spotlight that had found him only because he had married into it. History has not been particularly interested in Thierry Rousseau since Christina's death. History was not wrong to lose interest. The American Hospital of Paris continues to operate. The endowment Christina Onassis made to it has, in the decades since her death, contributed to the medical care of thousands of people who will never know her name. This is the kind of legacy that does not generate headlines, that cannot be photographed, that does not appear in gossip columns, that exists only in the accumulated small kindnesses of an institution doing its work. It is, arguably, the most Christina Onassis thing she ever did, giving something away, quietly, in someone else's name. And so the Onassis story ends where Greek stories have always ended, in the earth, on an island, in the presence of the sea. 3 generations in one family plot. A grandfather who built everything. A son who was supposed to carry it and died before he could. A daughter who carried it alone, for 13 years, against odds that the people who called her a troubled heiress never bothered to calculate. Gone now, all of them. The island sold to someone else's money, the ship still moving through the world's oceans, indifferent to the name on the company that once owned them. The foundation still doing its work. And in Switzerland, a woman in her 30s, Athena, the last Onassis, living a life that is hers and also, inescapably, everyone else's. Trying to be a person inside a name, as her mother tried, as her grandfather, in his magnificent and consuming way, made impossible. Which brings us to the only question that has ever mattered about this family. Not the money, not the ships, not the marriages or the divorces or the island or the graves, but what the Onassis story actually means. What it tells us about ambition, about inheritance, about the particular violence that dynasties do to the people born inside them, that we have not yet allowed ourselves to fully hear. Here is what the world got wrong about Christina Onassis. It looked at her life and saw a cautionary tale about wealth, about the insufficiency of money as a source of happiness, that familiar, comfortable moral that allows those without money to feel wise and those with money to feel misunderstood. It reached for the Barbara Hutton comparison, the poor little rich girl framework, the preassembled narrative that says, here is a woman who had everything and was still unhappy, which proves that happiness cannot be purchased. This is not wrong, exactly. It is just not nearly enough. Christina Onassis was not destroyed by wealth. She was destroyed by inheritance. And these are not the same thing. Aristotle Onassis built something extraordinary. The scale of what he built, starting from nothing. From refugee status in a foreign country, building through intelligence and tenacity, and a ruthlessness he never pretended not to have, is genuinely remarkable. It deserves to be acknowledged before it is examined. But here is what the building required, and what is almost never said. It required that everything around him, every relationship, every marriage, every child, be arranged in service of the project. Not deliberately, not with malice, but with the absolute unconscious priority of a man for whom the work was not what he did, but what he was. Aristotle Onassis did not have a life and also an empire. He had an empire that occasionally contained the furniture of a life. A wife, children, a famous mistress, a more famous second wife, arranged around the central fact of the work. And when he died, he left Christina not just his fortune, he left her his identity. This is the inheritance that destroyed her, not the $500 million, not the shipping empire or the island or the name. the identity. The instruction, written into the dynasty itself, that to be an Onassis was to be the empire, that the self and the business were not separate things, and that to fail at one was to fail at both, and that the world would be watching to see which it was going to be. Christina ran the empire. She ran it well. She ran it for 13 years under conditions that would have broken most people who had not grown up inside the particular toughness that Aristotle Onassis's household had produced. And while she was running it, she was also trying, in the marriages and the medications, and the movement between countries and the desperate, recurring investment in people who were not equal to the investment, to find the self that existed underneath the empire, the self that was hers rather than his. She never found it, not because it wasn't there, but because the empire was too loud, and the name was too large, and the world was too interested in the Onassis story to leave room for the Christina one. There is a word in Greek, kenosis, that theologians use to describe the act of emptying oneself completely in service of something larger. It is usually applied to the divine, but it applies with uncomfortable precision to what the Onassis dynasty asked of the people inside it. Empty yourself. Give everything. Become the name. Aristotle did this voluntarily. It was his choice, his project, his definition of a life worth living. Alexander never got to choose. He was 24 when he died, still inside the gravitational pull of his father's ambition, still becoming whoever he was going to be. Christina chose it too, but she chose it the way that children choose the values of their parents. Not freely, not from a position of knowing the alternatives, but because the alternative to being an Onassis was being nothing, and being nothing was the one thing she had been raised to fear more than anything else. Athena Onassis has, by the accounts available, spent her adult life attempting something that neither her mother nor her grandfather ever quite managed: to be a person first and an Onassis second. Whether she has succeeded is not for this story to say. What this story can say is this: the attempt is the right one, the only right one. And the fact that it took 3 generations and 3 deaths, and the sale of an island, and the dispersal of a fortune, and the quiet institutional continuity of a foundation, to arrive at a woman on a horse in a show-jumping ring trying to be a person. This is not a failure of the Onassis dynasty. It is what dynasties cost. It is what they always cost. Christina Onassis died at 37 years old, having run a global empire, raised a daughter, survived 4 marriages and 3 profound bereavements, given away significant portions of her inheritance to institutions and individuals and a government for $1, and tried, in every way available to her, with everything she had, to live a life that was genuinely hers inside a name that had never quite belonged to her. The world called her a troubled heiress. The world was describing the symptom and ignoring the disease. The disease was this: she was asked from birth to be the continuation of someone else's story, to carry a name that had been defined before she arrived, to inherit not just a fortune but an identity, complete, preformed, non-negotiable, and to live inside it as though it fit. It did not fit. It has never fit anyone who did not build it themselves. This is the thing about dynasties that the people who build them never understand, and that their children pay the price for understanding too late. A name is not a gift. It is a weight. And the difference between a weight that builds you and a weight that breaks you is not the weight itself. It is whether you chose to carry it. Aristotle Onassis wanted to build something that would last forever. He succeeded. The foundation bears his son's name. The scholarships bear his family's name. The hospital in Paris stands. The ships, reflagged, renamed, absorbed into other companies, are still moving cargo across the world's oceans. He built something that lasted. What he could not build, what no one can build for someone else, what cannot be inherited or transferred or purchased at any price, was a self. A private, interior, unbranded self that belonged to his daughter alone, that existed prior to the name and independent of the empire, and immune to the world's relentless appetite for the Onassis story. Christina Onassis spent 37 years searching for that self in shipping offices and hotel suites and marriage ceremonies and the waters around Scorpios and a bathtub in Argentina. She deserved more time. She deserved, more than the time, something simpler. A father who occasionally looked at her, not at the empire he was building, not at the successor he was training, not at the continuation of the name, but at her. At the dark-eyed girl with the serious face and the gift for languages and the business intelligence that surprised everyone who encountered it, and the capacity for love that was so large and so undefended that it broke her, repeatedly, against people who were not equal to it. Just her, just Christina. The saddest thing about Christina Onassis is not that she died at 37, or that she never found lasting love, or that the dynasty ended with a child being raised by the wrong people in the wrong country. The saddest thing is that she was one of the most capable people ever to carry the Onassis name, and the name itself was what prevented the world, and perhaps herself, from ever fully knowing it. She did not fail the dynasty. The dynasty failed her. And it did so from the very first moment she was given its name instead of her own. Every great fortune leaves behind a human story, one of ambition, love, sacrifice, or loss. Here, we tell those stories. If you enjoy thoughtful documentaries about old money, powerful families, forgotten heiresses, and the hidden stories behind history, consider subscribing to Old Money Society. New documentaries every 4 days. Until next time, thank you for watching.